At 8 people. Oh, I'm like sitting here like talking and recording something that doesn't stop in myself. That's cool. Hey, John.
Hey, Jeff.
How are you doing
Good.
in this actual apocalyptic world? For somebody who creates fake apocalyptic worlds, we're actually now living in the real apocalyptic world. It's crazy.
I'm prepared.
You are. Love it. Love it. Love it. All right, so I got like 8 people waiting, which is probably about half of the class. But so technically this class is, they switched it from being synchronous to asynchronous on me with like a day's notice. So technically I can't force everybody to get in on the Zoom calls. These are just, you know, part of their participation grade. So that's kind of what I'm doing at the moment. So generally we have about 12 people, I think, that get on these that have been pretty good and consistent with everything. Oh, thank you. What's wrong?
Mine was messed up.
Oh, do you want this?
Nope. My burger's fine. My fries are regular.
Oh. Okay. So, I am okay. So yeah, I'll let everybody in a minute. But just figured I should take a sec with you and figure out kind of how you wanted to do this. I know you kind of did it before, and you just kind of told your story, and we took questions. So I think I'll try to lead as much as I can with some questions. So I guess I'll put it out to you to kind of talk about your experience, and then I'll just pepper some things in and hopefully get students to ask this. Um, they're not the most boisterous classes that I've had, so I may have to kind of pull teeth a little bit. But
Okay.
Does that sound like a plan, or?
So to be clear, then interview style with some participation from the class, possibly. So just for my own background, what's the title and goal of the class itself?
Okay, so we are talking about schizophrenia and the other sort of subtypes. So I know schizoaffective would come in under that, but it's really just I've done a video for them on what the diagnostic criteria are, what the possible etiologies are, what the possible treatments are. So this is really just to give them a flavor of what it's like in the real world, living with it, experiencing it, kind of how it feels firsthand.
Okay.
Or secondhand. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to just make you schizophrenic there, but
Right. I that had been a concern for quite some time, that I could eventually have an episode, but that never happened.
yeah, I think you're out of the woods at our age. If
Yeah, I think that's safe.
mid-20s. But yeah, that is also very strongly genetic. So that is, you may wind up getting some questions about that, I assume. All right, so I guess if you're ready, I will open it up to everybody.
Okay, I'm ready.
Cool. That was a great face to come in on, Maggie. That was awesome. I like the the various surprised looks, and then, okay, you guys know the drill. If you are in a place where you can get on video, that would be nice, so that way John isn't just looking at names and he can actually see people who interact. At the very least, if you're able to ask a question, to kind of turn on your videos when you can. Trying to see if I forget who it was, but we had yeah. Don't worry, you don't. I mean, you're not trying. You don't need to impress anybody here. So we can see you would be nice. So I'll do introductions. We have a friend of mine, John, who, gosh, I've known John since grade school.
Grade school, yeah.
So yeah, that would be a very long time ago for those of you who are doing the math. And I had kind of given you a little bit of a preview of what we would be talking about and how it ties in. That John had some family experience with schizophrenia, specifically with schizoaffective disorder. So if anybody remembers, that is the combination of schizophrenia and major depression. So he'll, for the most part, tell his story about the family history with it. And we'll spend some time doing some questions and answers. I will try to do pretty much what I did with Justin, and I'll let John talk, and I'll throw some questions out there, and hopefully you guys will also have some good questions for him as well. The more you have a chance, the more you ask now, the more you will get out of it, because who knows, the next time you'll have a chance to ask questions like this and to talk personally with somebody who has experienced these things. The other thing that I really, I was thinking about it this morning, and there's kind of a side piece to this, which is, I had mentioned that I've known John since grade school, and full disclosure, I think I've become better friends with John way later in life. We weren't great friends in grade school. We didn't necessarily run in the same crowds, but a lot of people probably, I'm going to say all people, I don't think anybody probably knew at the time what John was dealing with. And then,
well, quite frankly, I didn't know what I was dealing with.
Yeah. So it's one of those things where, I think I'll take myself out of the young people group, but you guys as being young people, there is this sense of empathy or maturity that we don't necessarily even know what's going on with the people around us, with our peers, with our friends. So I wanted to add that piece to sort of say, hey, notice what's going on with the people that are close to you, or the people that aren't even necessarily close to you, because they may need an ear or support or understanding, or even just questions. Sometimes we don't ask enough questions about the people next to us, and they can feel kind of alone. I don't know if John, if that was your experience, but I want to throw it out there because I realize now I try to instill that in my kids, especially my daughter who's younger, she's 14. It's like, hey, if you notice somebody kind of going through something, you should be the person that asks how things are because somebody needs to. And it's not a pity thing, it's a human caring kind of thing. So that was kind of my little PSA soapbox uh, piece of it. And I will shut up now and let John talk about his experience. And so he'll tell the story. He'll kind of talk about who he is, how he's gotten to where he is, and I will throw in some questions and stuff as we go along. Pretty informal, but you guys all know the drill.
All right. Thanks, Jeff.
Sure.
So I'll begin at the beginning. I was raised in a household that had, my mother was schizophrenic. My grandparents lived with us. When I was very young, I didn't know that she was schizophrenic. When I was, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, I didn't know certainly what schizophrenia was or what the behavior was. I simply assumed, because I had no other frame of reference. At that age, how could you have experiences that you can compare to determine what is normal and what isn't? So to me, everything I experienced at that age, I had thought was normal and applied to everybody else just the same. So I thought that other people's mothers behaved the same way. And so I do recall her having random crying fits for no apparent reason. I recall her reading voraciously. She had always been a very avid reader and would consume books, newspapers. I learned later that, in high school, in college, she was a straight A student. The first incident that I can recall when I started to dawn on me that she was exhibiting abnormal behavior was maybe when I was 9 or 10. And she had an episode where she was convinced that my father was trying to murder her, and to get away, she was attempting to throw herself in front of traffic. This, for those of you that are familiar with Northeast Philadelphia, I had grown up just not too far from Roosevelt Boulevard. And you have that 12-lane highway. And she was on one of the medians trying to throw herself in front of traffic while my father was holding her arm, trying to hold her back. She would occasionally run away from home. Sometimes in dramatic fashion, she would leave, slam the door, and we wouldn't hear anything from her for several days until she was found, usually in New Jersey, on her way back to her mother's house on the Jersey Shore, where my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, had moved to. Somebody would take pity on her. She might be found crying on somebody's front steps, and they would question her, and get her phone number, and then my father would receive a call and go out for, 2 hours to pick her up.
So, and the grandparents that were living with you at the time were your dad's parents, then?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So, to give that some context, my grandparents were Ukrainian immigrants. They were World War II refugees, kicked off of their land when Stalin implemented collectivist farming. They were farmers, and they only knew some smattering of English, and so the communication between them and my mother was a point of contention. And there was frequent territorial disputes over who ran the kitchen between my mother and grandmother. During one of these episodes, she was committed. She went to Eastern Pennsylvania Psychiatric Institute, and my father decided I should see her in that environment. That supposedly at 12 years old, I was old enough to see this situation. And I distinctly recall sitting in the waiting room while he was filling out the billing paperwork, looking at the other patients. And there was a woman in the corner that would count on her hand while turning clockwise the number of turns she made, and then turn in the opposite direction, counting the same count. And my 12-year-old self was fascinated by this. I never saw this behavior in any adult. And that's when I had realized I was told she's in the hospital. That's when I realized that this isn't a hospital for people with bodily injuries. This is for somebody with mental illness, even though I was not familiar with the term mental illness.
And I was going to say, we grew up in a very unenlightened time where it really, I mean, I think we knew a little bit about maybe depression, maybe anxiety. And even that, even those kind of things were stigmatized. So I think today, maybe people have a little bit of a better idea, but for those of you here, none of us had any idea what schizophrenia was, what bipolar was, what ADHD was. There was just varying levels of crazy, thick, stupid. It was different. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut into your thing there. I was just giving everybody a little bit of an idea of how much we didn't really know back then.
And she would sometimes self-diagnose, and she would think that she was clinically retarded, and I use that term in the in a non-pejorative sense. She would cry at that alleged self-realization. She certainly was far from it. She certainly different issues, but not that. After he had finished the paperwork, we walked down the hallway to a room where she was held, and he had to hold me up to look through this small square window. And I distinctly recall her being strapped to a table. She had been given Thorazine, and she was yelling that the light of the lamp above her is consuming her. It's taking her soul. And that was a stark realization. And at 12, this was rather difficult to take in. She eventually would get a prescription for, at that time, it was Mellaril. I know the prescriptions have changed over decades, but this was the 80s. It was Mellaril. And as long as she took it on a daily basis, she would feel better and she would behave more normally. She never, by the way, had a driver's license, never held a job in the time that I knew her. I couldn't imagine her driving a car. I doubt she'd make it down the block without an accident. She was always clumsy. And this is a pattern that I saw with her time and again, where she would take the medication, she would feel good, she would deem herself cured, she'd stop taking the medication, and she would relapse. And I this was a problem when my father was alive, when he was essentially her caretaker. He would make sure she was medicated, but there were times that he didn't monitor as closely as he should have, and she would stop taking it, have another episode, and we would go through the same cycle again and again and again. And she had manic bouts when she would watch television through the night, read through the night, keep me up with the volume of the television. I couldn't sleep in my own room upstairs. I slept on the couch in the living room for years because her routine at night was so disruptive and so loud, I couldn't sleep. And there was one evening when I was woken with a knock at the door by a couple of police officers who had stopped at the house because they saw flames from the upstairs bedroom window. She had fallen asleep smoking in bed. And they managed to rescue my grandparents, but my second floor was destroyed. All my possessions were up in flames. And at the time, I happened to be collecting comic books, and had they survived, I might have had a decent collection there. Shortly after the fire, both my grandparents had passed away, not as a direct cause of the fire, but they had strokes from the stress of it afterward. So then it was just me and my parents. And the same routine continued. She would have an episode, she would run away, she would get found again, until after high school graduation, my father was diagnosed with cancer. It was caught too late. By the time I was 19, he had passed away. So here I am left with only my mother, and I'm an only child. And I'm now her caretaker. But of course, she felt that I was her son. She was my mother. She's supposed to take care of me, not the other way around. So she refused any my attempts at medicating her. Without my father around, things fell apart rapidly. I couch surfed at friends' houses for about a year. The house fell into disrepair when I was able to get a involuntary committal. She was having an episode, and I called 911. And the paramedics administered an initial psychological test. She was committed on, I believe it's involuntary, right? In the County of Philadelphia, it's a 201 committal. And she went in for a longer period of time, for about 2 weeks. I straightened up the house, and it was an absolute disgusting mess. There were newspapers scattered 3 feet high in the center of the living room, avalanched out to every corner of the living room. The bathroom was a biohazard. I'll leave it at that. I consulted a lawyer about getting guardianship and having her committed, but she was not yet proven to be a danger to herself. The delusional nature of her condition manifested significantly in this period. She would sometimes, when I was a teenager, she would, sometimes hear people, while out for a walk, she would, see people walking on the other side of the street, having a conversation among themselves, and insist that it's about her. They're talking about her. If they were laughing, they were laughing at her. But these levels of delusion greatly increased. she, with my father out of the picture, she thought that she would get remarried. She formed a fixation on the Philly mob boss, Joey Merlino. And whenever it was prom season and a limousine would drive by with a bunch of kids going to prom, but that wasn't going to the prom, that was Joey's boys looking out for her. A landscaping truck went down the street and she took that as a sign that she was going to marry not just a landscaper, but specifically an Irish landscaper. It had an Irish sounding name on the landscaping truck. And not that particular landscaper, just some Irish landscaper was in her destiny. I still couldn't do anything about it, not legally. It wasn't until a particularly bad winter. There's a blizzard, and she was convinced that, again, I could not live with her. By this point, I had a friend of mine had gone off to college, and his mother very kindly rented a room to me. That wasn't too far from my house, so I could still check on her every once in a while. But she had become convinced that somebody was going to break into the house and murder her. Her solution was to attempt to sleep in front of the house on the front porch. But even that was too close to the house. So she decided to try and sleep in the middle of the road during this blizzard. Of course, I was completely unaware of this until after the fact. A neighbor saw her, took pity on her, called 911. She was rushed to a medical hospital, treated for frostbite, and lost a few of her toes. Finally, I could prove that she is a physical danger to herself. The lawyer that I had been in touch with had put together a case where I could go before Philadelphia's Orphans Court and argue this case. And I was awarded guardianship. I had her placed in the, Jeff, you probably know this a little more than I do, Beth Lieberman Homes in Philadelphia. They monitor psychiatric patients and make sure they are medicated. So if they happen to leave the premises, if the patient leaves the premises, they call 911. And at least there, I could sleep at night knowing that she was being monitored and cared for. She still had occasional, delusions about various patients. She was never mechanically inclined in the least. And I recall she swore to me that the television in her room was broken. And I checked the remote control. It needed a change of batteries. And I changed the batteries, and all of a sudden, you could swear by her reaction, you would think that I had cured cancer. And she was absolutely thrilled. And in those 5 minutes, I could do no wrong. But that, of course, would quickly change. There were a couple of funny cases where she turned to me and said, John, you got to get me out of here. People in here are crazy. When I was in, while this case was building, I did manage to get an apartment in South Philadelphia. And this was before, cell phones. I had an answering machine. And she had several manic episodes when she would constantly call me, even though I wasn't home, and eat up the entirety of my answering machine tape. I would get home and there would be 20 messages, and 18 of them would be from her, and I couldn't get to my own personal messages for wading through her, because she would ramble and ramble and ramble and use the maximum amount of time allotted. And there was more than one case where I was listening to the answering machine, and she would call. I would be getting her in stereo. I had to pull the phone from the wall to get peace. She would sometimes find, it's Philadelphia, and at this this home is in Balkinwood, and she sometimes when she would leave, she would find a used condom on the street, and she would interpret that as Joey Merlino saving himself for her in some fashion or another. She found somebody that had the same name as Joey Merlino in the phone book with his address, and started snail mailing him love letters. And he would reply asking, please stop, I'm not who you think I am. It just happened to be somebody that had the same name. But these fixations of hers were seemed to come out of nowhere, and once she had them, they stuck. It was impossible to disabuse her of these delusions. I stopped trying. I didn't feed into them, nor did I attempt to disabuse her of any of these notions. It was a lost cause. I didn't arrive at that easily. It took years to get there.
Was there ever a point in her life where she had any relief from this, or any lucidity during any kind of medicated times, or?
Well, I'm an only child, so I don't know. I don't have the perspective of older siblings that have observed her, but my aunt knew her when she was a child, and what she recollects is that when my mother was young, when she was a teenager, she didn't seem to exhibit this behavior. She was an active high school student. She was on her newspaper, on her high school newspaper, and would she remembered one particular article she contributed about the boisterousness of a Boy Scout troop that my grandfather was the scoutmaster. He was the leader of a Boy Scout troop, and the Boy Scouts were making a ruckus in the family home, and she recorded that incident. The first time that she surfaced this behavior was at Temple University. She had her first breakdown, and I don't know the exact circumstances, but my aunt was called and drove her to a hospital for further evaluation. My aunt recalled that during that trip, during that drive, my mother threatened to light her hair on fire. She was smoking. She smoked all her life, and she had a lighter. After graduation, she did manage to get a job for a couple of years, I suppose, at Social Security. So she was able to maintain employment for a time, and then had an episode and was let go. I think it was fortunate that her boss at the time took pity on her, and I understand that he made sure she got disability, SSI disability. There were times when she did have some normalcy when I was teenager, we would vacation at my maternal grandmother's house in Ocean City. My mother would stay with us. She would stay there for the 2 or 3 months while we were there. And I don't remember any episodes then. Maybe she felt like she was at home. Maybe she felt more at ease with her own mother there. I'm sure that my father's parents being in the household was a matter of friction for her, and she didn't have that around to be a catalyst for disruption. So I think it was during, at least when I knew her, it was during those times at the Jersey Shore that things were on even keel as far as I can remember.
Wow. Yeah, so I mean, I have a bunch of questions that kind of were coming up for me as I was going, but I don't want to stop you if you are mid-thought or midstream. But like one of the things that I wonder, I keep sort of putting myself mentally in the role of your dad and wondering, here's somebody at the time while he was around, and then essentially you took that role where it was one single person, one single guy taking care of this other life, which I assume was essentially living the entire, like he had to be in charge of that the entire time. So I assume he was living basically his life and her life as well, and also trying to keep a 12-year-old fed and clothed and in school and somewhat happy and trying to do the right things. Looking back on it, what was your dad's life like, and what was the quality of his life? What was his experience?
Yeah. So ever since I could remember, my mother and father never shared a bedroom. My mother had her own room, and my father was handy around the house, and he built himself essentially a bedroom out of a corner in the basement. He had a raised floor, insulated walls, and it sure looked like a ship's cabin. Like everything was very neat and organized, but small and compact. And again, when I was a child, I thought, oh, well, this is how all parents live. I had no other reference. He was very much her caretaker. He was less her husband, more her caretaker. He worked a night job, and so I remember when I would go to school, he would be coming home from work. We would be at the same table for breakfast, and then next time I would see him was when 7, 8 o'clock, when he would get up and go to work. So during the day, it was largely my mother, my grandparents. He had to mediate disputes between my grandparents and my mother. He spoke Ukrainian and English, so he could translate between the two. He was maybe 5 or 6 years old when he came to America. When I was in my senior year, he revealed to me that he was planning to divorce my mother and marry this other woman who had been a prior love of his life, and even took me to see her, and threatened to cut off my college tuition, which he never paid anyway, and he never had it saved to begin with. But he and threatened me with that, so I wouldn't tell my mother. Cancer took him before that could come to fruition, but at the time I was infuriated with him. How could he do this to our family? Over time, I've come to understand his position. Not that I necessarily condone his actions, but I understand that my mother wasn't his wife. She was, at that point, she was discharged. I mean, one can certainly ask a legitimate question. Why did he marry her in the first place? And you'd have to ask him. So I think he was also living a life of quiet desperation that I had no insight into until this rather telling infidelity. I'm not even sure if I could call it that, because they were, I don't think they had been intimate since I had been born. He took a lot of solace in his work. He did a lot of carpentry. He was a gearhead. At one point we had 7 vehicles. He liked classic cars. And I think that's where he buried his attention. It was after my grandparents had passed away that he had gotten those vehicles, because they were reticent to change. And I think that's also why the fire had ultimately, indirectly, killed them. It was a change they were unprepared for, and the shock was too great. So I think after they had passed away, he felt more liberty to change living arrangements. Our house was remodeled after the fire. And he had cut corners when making decisions on how it should be remodeled. So, like, rather than getting a plaster ceiling replaced on the second floor, he had a drop ceiling put in. And I think that's where he ended up getting the money from the cars. He took the insurance payout and put it towards that. So he, I think in his own way, was also trying to escape. It did afford me some distance from her, physical distance, because my bedroom that I couldn't occupy because of her nightly activity was now I could move to a room that wasn't physically connected. I had more privacy and more physical and metaphorical isolation from her. I don't recall us ever going to a family vacation. We never, as a family, we never went anywhere. My family vacation was going to the Jersey Shore, and which I was perfectly happy to do. That was some happiest time of my childhood. But we never even went out to restaurants. We went out once. I do remember this, to a Chinese food restaurant that was within walking distance. And my mother clumsily tried to use the chopsticks and got half the food all over her. She had always been a messy eater. And I think I saw then why we didn't go out to restaurants.
So fast forward a little bit. So it sounds like, kind of that I had jotted down that 19 was kind of an important age for you, in which, we're looking at, we have a room full of people who are in that, close to that age at this point, and hopefully they can kind of realize, what would they have done in a similar situation? So this is where you're in a position where you needed to have her committed. You're trying to figure out how to have a life of your own. You do not have any support in terms of brothers and sisters. You had just lost your dad. How does how does you, John, your life kind of play out through your 20s and later into your 30s? How did you find a way, and the strength, the ability to separate yourself and have an actual life? And I mean, I know that you're a successful person now with kind of multiple careers, and you managed to do this. And the other kind of piece of it is, was there ever any worry in the back of your head that, oh shit, this could be something that I could experience? This is something, if I have kids, my kids could experience. Did that affect relationships, aspirations, things like
Yes,
that as you kind of moved forward?
yes, absolutely. Uh, it occurred to me not long, when I was 13, 14, that I have her genes. And so, excuse me, I did uh, do some research and see, okay, what are the chances that, I was, at the time, I wasn't thinking of children. I was thinking about my own risk factors. And what are the chances that I'll end up the same way as her? So I felt like I had this sort of Damocles hanging over my head. I did talk to my aunt. My aunt, by the way, was helpful once I had my mother committed, but she was marginally useful when I was going through this this time when I was couch surfing. Um, but I did ask her, when did my mother first surface these symptoms? When did she have her first episode? What was the catalyst for it? And my understanding I got from her was that, this tends to happen when you have a, late teens, early 20s, when there's typically a stressful situation is the catalyst, loss of a loved one, moving to college, a significant change, a divorce. And so going to college, I suppose, going to a dorm was her catalyst. So I had no way of knowing, what's going to be my trigger. Am I going to have a trigger? Am I even going to be self-recognize it when it occurs? Having lived through the fire when I was a freshman in high school, having had my grandparents pass away shortly after, having my father tell me that he was planning on divorcing my mother when I was 18 and marrying this woman that he's seeing. While all of those were upsetting, none of those were a trigger for an episode. I had never become completely disconnected from reality. So I thought, if I could survive that without without requiring hospitalization, then I'm probably okay. It was after living through my father's passing that I thought, okay, well, as traumatic as that was, I still didn't have an episode like my mother had. So I thought, okay, now I'm in the clear. At least that much is no longer a threat. When my father did pass away, I had that feeling that I was a marionette pulling my own strings. I did have a bit of disconnected feeling, but I think that was more of a byproduct of the situation as opposed to a chemical imbalance. And my next concern was, okay, well, following Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You need shelter, right? Before I could even think about college education or a job, quite frankly, I needed shelter where I wasn't subjected to my mother's ranting and raving. And I needed to get away. I could not live with her. And I had a friend who, I did not have a car at the time. I needed to get away from my mother. I didn't have a place to go. And we went for a drive late at night. Got into an accident and the car had flipped end over end. Still have a couple of scars from that. And I called her from the hospital. And that's when she, rather than expressing any sympathy, she didn't bother to hear whether I had been injured. She had just started yelling at me for having been in the accident in the first place. And pardon my language, but that's when I hit my breaking point, and with her. And that's when I said to my mother, fuck you, go to hell. I hung up and I did not go back to the house. That's when I started couch surfing. I couldn't subject myself back to that situation. She was beyond my influence. I couldn't be that caretaker for her that my father was. And of course, I felt anger at him for having saddled me with this. Once I did manage to get my feet under me, and I did manage to get a stable place to stay, I still didn't have a lot of income, but I had some. I did manage to find at least a job that paid a little bit more than minimum wage, and I went to Philadelphia Community College with the plans of matriculating. And opportunities at college presented themselves. I managed to get a slightly more stable position. I got an apartment, and at least I couldn't help my own mother before I stabilized. That was when it was around that time when I had gotten an apartment. That was when the incident involving the blizzard occurred. And by the time I got out of college, I went from making a near, slightly above minimum wage paying job to a job in my first job in software development. So I went from making, maybe $7, $8 an hour to making $30,000 a year. And I thought I was living it up. I thought I was rich. Then this was during the 90s. Yeah. So if you could spell the word internet, right, you could write your own ticket. And I rode that wave. And so I didn't need to return to college, at least for the next pay increase and the one after that. So I rode that wave for all it was worth. Having the stability of that first job let me focus more on getting her stabilized. It was then that I managed to get guardianship and have her placed in that home. It was also then when I was able to reclaim the home I grew up in. So now this is the second time it's being remodeled. I ended up doing quite a bit of the work myself. I felt like remodeling that house was something of a catharsis. I took it down to the studs I knocked out a wall in the kitchen to put in an island. There was carpeting. I put in hardwood floors. I took out my father's small shack in the basement. It looked nothing like it did when I was growing up by design. And I moved back in for over a decade. Back in 2010, I sold that one for another home, but I felt like I had reclaimed my reclaimed the space that I fought hard for.
So how about I'll ask one more question, then I'll open it up for students so they don't just have to keep listening to me. So I notice picture in the background. I assume that at some point you had relationships, or how did that play?
Oh yeah. So
I mean, you had no idea what a normal relationship would look like if it hit you in the face.
right. So I mean, I was dating, and I did date a bit in high school, not with people that we knew in high school, but at other high schools. And right. So this also affected my plans for children. You did touch on that. And I did see a genetics counselor to see what my risk was for passing the genes on. And effectively, it's 50-50. I saw what that did to my mother, and I wouldn't wish that upon anybody. When she did pass away, and by the way, that was in 2000. It was a massive heart attack. I'm told that she was dead before she hit the floor. And I regret that she did not have a normal life. And I didn't, I couldn't, in good conscience, risk that. I didn't want to spin that roulette wheel on somebody else's life. So I don't have any children. I don't plan to have any children. So, that decision did weigh into relationships. But I think by the time that I was dating more seriously, I had gotten my feet under me. By that point, I did have an apartment, right? By that point, I had a decent paying job. And I had enough relationships by that point to understand what's healthy and what's not. And now, I'm still not married, but Mary Ann and I have a house together. We're, for all intents and purposes, practically married. We just, without children in the mix, just haven't made that legal obligation. But yeah, I met Mary Ann in '98 at a Halloween party, and yeah, we've been together since.
All right. So let me open it up to the students. So you guys have been hearing everything. Uh-oh. Are you or am I still with you guys, or can you still hear me? Okay, because it just told me I disconnected, but luckily I guess I didn't. Okay, so guys, do you have any questions for John about his history or where he is right now? Somebody could ask him about what his non-IT job is. That's kind of a fun a fun question as well, and I wonder how his experience has affected that. What do you guys have for John? Anyone? Come on. Well, I will ask then. You're so is it a job? Is it a hobby? Is it a passion? And do you channel any of your kind of crazy history in doing it?
Well, right. So what Jeff is referring to is the fact that I've shot, produced, written a number of short films that have made their circuit through various film fests, both nationally and internationally. It is a passion. I certainly didn't make any money off of that, but it's a heck of a lot of fun. You meet people that you never would have met through any other walk of life. So you can find me on IMDb. Like if you just search on IMDb for my name, I am the only one on there with my name. When we went to write a script, I have a film partner that I work with, since around 2010, 11. That when we sit down to write something, we tend towards horror because it's easy to do on a small budget, and any independent filmmaking is always on a small micro budget. So horror, drama is usually the genres that independents pursue. But when I sit down to write horror, it usually evolves into comedy horror. And so the first short film that we produced was I hesitate to even call it a short film. This was just a little video that we did called Blobageddon. That features a little animated blob that was entered into the Colonial Theater's annual Blob Fest competition up in Phoenixville. And that ended up winning an award. So I thought, well, gee, maybe there's a little something to this. And that led to a longer short film called Zombie Casserole that asked the question, well, what if the zombie apocalypse came and went, and it was a non-event, and zombies are just trying to reintegrate themselves into society, and they're second-class citizens. So you get some of the Archie Bunker kind of stereotypical character hosting a family dinner, and the brother-in-law was in a car accident, and they don't know how bad it was until he shows up for dinner as a zombie, and hijinks ensue. It was a lot of fun to shoot and film that. I haven't done any filmmaking in the last year or so with COVID. Right, it's things have been pretty locked down. But I also co-founded a startup in 2018, so a lot of my attention was directed there, even prior to that. But where does some of the past experiences come in? Some of it was drawn from the absurdity of the interaction I had with my mother, and I'm not talking about the tragic stuff. There were some odd comedic moments where I'll relate one more anecdote here. When I was in high school, in grade school, we had bus schedules that we were assigned to. Right? You remember that, Jeff? We had I think they were like 1, 2, 3, and 4 waves of buses that would come through and pick the students up. So I was on the last bus one year, the last round of buses. So I had like an extra 45 minutes to an hour after classes finished before I would get bused back home. So that's when I would do my homework. And by the time I got home, you know, the afternoon cartoons are on. That's where my attention is. My homework would be done. My mother asked me, you know, how do you get your homework done so fast? I told her, but she was unhappy with that explanation. For whatever reason, she didn't accept it and said, I know how you get your homework done so fast. You're a pimp and you get your prostitutes to do it for you.
Oh my God, I don't mean to laugh.
Where the hell did that come from, right? I don't know. I think I was maybe 11 or 12, but I had a vague notion of what that was. And I asked her, how did you come to that conclusion? Yeah. And she said, oh, I just put 2 and 2 together. I said, yeah, and you got 5. And we would have these arguments. And once I remember her saying, John, you're always wrong, as she was going up the steps and as she was getting her last word in. And I said, you know, Mom, you're absolutely right. And I could see the wheels spinning, and she just grimaced and stomped up the stairs.
I think that's one of the best stories. So that is one of the best. Like, that is fantastic. Yeah.
And there are lots of these arguments that you have that you can think of. Okay, I should have said this, or I could have had this come back. But that was one where I felt like I was I couldn't have done better on that one.
That was perfect. Perfect.
And so some of that kind of interaction, I think, influenced some dialogue absurdity. So I do sometimes gravitate towards theater of the absurd. Maybe I haven't really honestly thought about, but perhaps that's a root cause right there. But when it comes to like depiction of mental illness in film, there is a script that I've been sitting on that I'd like to do that that I haven't tackled, that's on a more serious bent, wherein I wanted to show what it would be like using the visual language of film to tell the story of what somebody may be experiencing from their perspective when they're having an episode.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I do have a script, but I haven't had the bandwidth to put that in action, because I don't think that mental illness itself should be used as a vehicle for comedy. I took some inspiration from the absurd dialogue I had, but I put the absurd dialogue in the mouths of people that are supposed to be rational, that are in an absurd situation. But I don't want to use schizophrenia itself as a comedic effect. For comedic effect, I'd rather, I'd rather give that a more serious treatment. And I did work with another filmmaker who happens to be bipolar, to put that together, because I wanted to get the perspective of somebody who has it under control, and she does. But I wanted to get her input, because while I've seen the effects of that, I haven't been diagnosed with as bipolar or schizophrenic or schizoaffective, so I still can't speak to what that's like firsthand. So I don't. That it's a long answer to your question there, Chuck.
Yeah, I wonder, have there been any kind of thinking on the same terms of media. Have there been any films or television that you've seen that you feel like accurately depicts schizophrenia, or based on your experience? I think people may try, but I don't know how accurate it always is.
There's one that comes to mind, Babadook.
Okay.
So that it is a horror film. In that one, the monster in that film is a proxy for the depression and mental illness that this child's mother feels. And so and this may be a minor spoiler, but it's a monster that terrorized the child. And so it's a way for the child to rationalize and contextualize the episodes that his mother undergoes. So when his mother's undergoing episodes, it's not his mother's, it's this monster.
Gotcha. That's pretty interesting. I'll have to look that one. I'll have to check that out. So Abigail, Courtney, Elise, Jamie, Maggie, Maya, Mikhail, Noel, Vinny, anybody? Questions? Maggie asked an interesting one. Is there any other history of schizophrenia in your family?
Good question. And none that I know of on my mother's side. Well, that's not entirely true. It's not entirely true. My mother had two siblings. My uncle had substance abuse problems, and he passed away from cirrhosis of the liver. He drank himself to death. Now, whether he also experienced depression or not, I don't know. But based on what I've observed from in the time that I knew him, very likely he did. But I don't know if that history goes farther back. After my mother passed away, my aunt kind of disconnected herself from me, so I haven't had the opportunity to dive into that side of the family's history. So it's possible. I wouldn't rule it out. I saw suggestion that my uncle, her brother, could have been clinically depressed. Certainly saw substance abuse, but I don't know any more details than that.
Good. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you for the answer for the question. Anybody else? Before we give John back his day. Man, I can't believe. What if I were to throw a couple of like extra bonus points or something? It's like you have to beg. This is rough. Okay, as an only child as well, Elise says, I can't imagine what your experiences must have been like. Were there any instances where you wished you had a sibling to talk to?
That gets back to the state of what's your frame of reference for what is normal. After my grandparents passed away, I did have a cat. I don't think that happened to be found in the woods. We found a litter of kittens that had been abandoned, and I and a couple of friends brought them back. We adopted most of them out. I kept one. The cat itself was a comfort. It was a very friendly, playful cat. that did bring some comfort. Now, whether I wish I had them to talk to or not, I don't think so, because I think my perspective on that was one largely of self-reliance. And I recall when my father had passed away, I had a social worker who suggested that I see a therapist just to, work through his death. And I didn't need a therapist. I needed somebody to give me some practical advice about how do I even begin arranging for a funeral? Yeah, I needed some practical questions answered. How do I apply for college tuition? How do I apply for a loan? How do I navigate this paperwork? I was more focused on pragmatic results. So a sibling would have been helpful to share the burden, absolutely. But as far as moral support, I don't know that I necessarily needed the moral support. I needed I needed assistance. I needed somebody else that could medicate her.
Where was your prostitutes then, John? They should have
I
been.
know. They were. That's why I had to let them go.
Oh. All right. Any others? Any other questions? I'll tell you, this COVID teaching is not easy. So hopefully this was at least beneficial for everybody to hear. I think it's always really nice to have a real world view on things. Textbooks go so far, movies aren't accurate. So I really, you have no idea how much I appreciate you coming in to talk about stuff like this. So I know it's not easy, even though the time has gone by. But I think it is just incredibly helpful to give people perspective that there's no other way for them to get. So I'd like to just say thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And I love seeing the place that you're in and what you've, how you've gotten there. It's it that makes me so happy. So I really do thank you for coming on and talking to us on the show today. Which
there is one more piece I do want to relate.
Yeah.
With respect to that, how do you bridge that gap from floating to getting on your feet? And I want to speak to that first job that I got that gave me a break. And my money had been running out. So I had, my motivation was, quite frankly, find a job or starve. At least I wasn't familiar with how to apply for social benefits. That was outside my ken. I didn't even know that it had existed. Right. So my motivation was quite literally between getting a job and starvation. So it's a pretty strong motivator. So when I was at community college, the opportunities were limited to what was available to community college students. I had a friend that was going to University of Pennsylvania. I didn't go to the community college job boards. I went to the University of Pennsylvania job boards. And I pulled down a few from there. I did not go to large corporations because I figured that they would have more more requirements for hiring. They would require a 4-year degree, which I certainly didn't have at the time, which I knew I couldn't qualify for. So I went for the smaller, more independent companies. And there was I showed up in person. I dropped off my resume at one particular firm, and they said, "Okay, well, we'll call you back." And I showed up 3 days later, saying, "Well, where's my phone call? Where's my interview?" And they, "Well, we'll be in touch." And I showed up again 3 days later. I'm still waiting for it. And I made a pest of myself. They eventually gave me the interview. I was hired on a 2-week trial basis, and that was what led to my first job. 6 months later, I got myself a $5,000 raise. 6 months after that, I made a leap to an even larger raise at another company. And that's because I worked my ass off, because I knew that if I didn't do this, I don't know where I would be. I'm not suggesting that you stalk your employer. That worked for me back then in the mid 90s. But persistence absolutely does pay off. That's always been my experience. And it's also been my experience that if I ask for more than you think they'll give you, at that time, when I was looking to switch jobs, I didn't necessarily need that next job. So I asked for more than what I thought I would get, and I still got it. So be bold. Fortune does favor the bold. I've taken that approach, which is what landed me at a startup incubator at MIT in 2018. I was building a startup off of their campus in Cambridge. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't take a few risks, and if I didn't have that kind of motivation.
That's amazing advice and feedback. Thank you. Well, I think you might have a fourth calling at this point, which could just be, speaking, motivational. It's really, I had to pause a couple times there. That was very, very, very good. Thank you.
Absolutely. I hope you guys, whose faces I don't see, I hope you guys got something out of it.
Can you guys at least turn on for a minute and just smile at John, wave something? So if you're not, the only time I've been able to get these guys to turn their cameras on is when I had the recording artist on. I guess that if you're not on a multi-platinum label, John, sorry, you don't get to see people's faces. Oh, there's Courtney.
Hello.
Courtney's still in bed. Courtney was in bed for Justin's call as well. So.
Hello, Maggie.
Very good. All right.
All right.
Thank you, John. Thank you guys for your attention. And again, really, really appreciate it very much.
All right. Bye, guys.
See y'all.